Hello, Douglas Scott McCarron. I want to talk about Baal Yahweh, and I know it as Elohim, though I've recently heard it called Elohim. I don't know. There's these three sort of godlike creatures in the Bible. Baal is the bad, evil one that you sacrifice your children to for the Canaanites. Yahweh is the one that ended up being the God of the Jews. Elohim, or I don't know, however it's pronounced. He's like this grandfatherly wisdom, forgive, be patient. Baal is a rain god, a thunder god, but he's more like on the coast. So Baal kind of like brings the spring rains to a lot of believers. He was kind of a cool dude because he brought food. Yahweh is kind of this storm god too, but it's more like up on the hill, so it's like torrential rains that run through the valleys and kind of tear up things. I mean, this is we're talking about real early. Also very much a warrior god. And during the history of Judaism, you had the northern kingdom had some Yahweh and some Baal in there, and it eventually got crushed by, I believe, the Assyrians. And then what was left was, I believe, Judea, and they had Yahweh. And so a lot of the editing that goes on, what us Catholics rudely call the Old Testament, it's always, there's this discussion about those horrible Jews who turned against Yahweh and worshipped Baal. And you also have things like, we got the Egyptian army wandering through, and the Assyrians running through, and the Hittites running through. Do you want a nice, friendly, grandfatherly, wise, forgiving God like Elohim, or do you want a bloodthirsty warrior god who's going to go out there and kick their ass? I suspect probably the latter is more important when it comes down to national survival. But these are all kind of all smushed together. And one thing to know about, like, the books that are in the Bible, they're now set. Christianity has kind of taken these books and turned them into, it's like this proof text that shows everything that's points toward the incarnation of Christ and the opening the gates and paying the atonement. But even, like the writings of Paul, it's not even clear he wrote all the ones that are claimed to be him. Because the way of speaking, the level of Greek writing is different in all of them. So even those, the New Testament, we have it like here's these books, it's codified, this has always been here. They used to just be a bunch of scrolls running around in letters, and they would make copies and send them to each other. There wasn't a Bible. And it's also true that what we call the Old Testament, it's just a bunch of writings and opinions and thinkings about things. There's nowhere in the Bible that I can think of outside of 1 Timothy that anyone ever claims this is like the written word of God and God made it all happen. They're all just constantly sitting here looking out at what's going on around them and trying to make sense of it. Or, have the country survive, You notice that, for instance, there's apparently, when they got taken away to Babylon, the explanation was that all the majority of the Jews turned against Yahweh, and so Yahweh left the temple and wasn't there to protect him, and so they run away. They get taken away into Babylonian captivity, and then when they come back, it's very strict, staying within the strictures and the agreement with God, that's part of why Jesus shows up and says, "Hi, I'm this wonderful guy who's going to do something." But in Judaism, no man can be a god or be godlike, and here's this supposedly asserting that he is that. But not all the gospel. John is like all over. In the beginning was the Word became flesh. Blah 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 blah. Matthew or Mark doesn't do all that. He doesn't really have a big claim in there. So it's kind of like you can see the changes in thought within the writings. But this is why you can go into the Old Testament and God is like one chapter, be peaceful and loving and wise and love your children and on and on. And, that's the Elohim part. And then the next one, take out your sword and slaughter your enemies and cut off all their heads and kill their babies. That's the vicious warrior God. Yes. So you have to, it's somewhat wild to read it because it's presented to us as this is this proof text and it's rigid and this is the way, but it's actually just this kind of conglomeration of things that got stuck together however the editors wanted to back then. And now it's like set in steel, and now we all argue about who's right, who has the right interpretation, and who knows if we're actually even talking about God, if we're just talking about our opinions. At least that's my understanding. The whole idea about sacrificing your children to Baal, that's more the Phoenicians. It says the sacrifice, the wording is sacrifice to Moloch, but that's how I understand it being pronounced. The thing is all the people who knew how to pronounce those words are all dead. We don't actually know how to pronounce the words. And then you add on, I'm reading it in English. I'm reading a English translation of a Latin or Greek translation of somebody's opinion who went through a bunch of historical changes, which then kind of routed back to the Jewish source of it, overlaid with a bunch of Platonism and Greek thought. So it's not entirely clear we're getting the clear understanding of what's being said. But anyway, the whole idea is, you're not supposed to sacrifice your child to Baal, but it's not really clear they did. And you're not supposed to sacrifice it to Moloch, but there's this, I watch, it's called Esoterica and Religion for Breakfast, and there's this discussion that Moloch, actually it's like the Moloch. It's like it's something you do, it's not a god. So it's not even clear that's what's going on. That's probably, I don't know, you all may know the story of Isaac and Abraham, where Abraham is supposed to be the father of the nation that's going to bring, the Judaic people forth, and they will worship God and make sure that God's always present here in the world. And his wife Sarah doesn't have any children, and then when they were like, over 100 years old, they have this child named Isaac. And then at one point, God says Abraham, and Abraham says, ready. And this is the story of sacrificing Isaac, the child, to God. And I've had a lot of people say, Abraham's like, oh, my poor child, I love him, blah, blah. Well, in the book, it doesn't say that. He just says, ready. And God says, take him to this mountain and sacrifice him. And Abraham goes and does it because that's what everybody did with their firstborn male child. Got to appease the gods. But the key to the story is a couple of things. One is when Abraham's all ready and he's got the knife up and he's about to stab Isaac, God says, Abraham, Abraham, lay not thy hand upon thy child and sacrifice him unto me. As, the other people, this is like God coming into history and saying, stop doing that. The other thing is Isaac is the only surviving child out of which all of this Judaism is going to come forth, and it's about to be killed. He's about to be killed. And another thing that I've read is that Isaac apparently means the laughter of God. So you're going to sacrifice the laughter of God to gods that don't exist. It all sounds very bloody, but, if you're living in a world where empires are running around slaughtering each other, and when women have birth, 40-50% of them die because they're ripped apart, and we're all born in blood. The animals rip each other apart. There's blood everywhere. There's blood sacrificed constantly. So it kind of makes sense that you have blood sacrificed to the gods, because that seems to be the way things are set up. We do it now. How many wars, we sit here and talk about, theoretically, but how many wars are we running around sacrificing our children and blowing up, civilians and other people's tanks and economies just because we got some idea in our head? Let's go into Iraq and kill Saddam Hussein and tell them how to design their culture and their way of politics. Well, that didn't work out very well for anybody. The U.S. kind of left after a while, having spent a great deal amount of money, and a lot of Iraqis were killed. And then they had the Civil War, and they all have their factions of my belief's the right one, and ISIS and the government troops, and everyone's running around killing each other. We're all still worshiping these gods and having blood sacrifice still. So it's not unusual. The other thing that's really unusual now, I guess, that the big contribution supposedly from Christianity is maybe that's not a good idea to do that so much unless you really have to. We don't seem to have quite gotten to let's not do it yet. But, I do find it ironic that a lot of people, not everybody, sits there and looks back at those bloodthirsty, horrible, bad, so glad we advanced. They didn't have World War I, they didn't have World War II. They didn't have this war in Iraq where 750,000 Russians have been killed and wounded, and who knows how many Ukrainians. And meanwhile in Syria, the Assad, the ophthalmologist, has been famous for dropping chlorine gas on his people to kill them. I keep hearing we've advanced, but I don't know if we are. It seems to me we're still in the same situation, and some people either reach out for changing this or they don't. Women, you have this argument about abortion, so, don't kill the babies, except now some of the mothers are getting torn up and dying, and it's just seems to be there's something here that's not quite ordered. The gods seem to want it seems like something wants blood here. I don't know if it's God, but something around here wants blood. I suggest not working with it. I don't know that it's God, though. And then what is God? There's God who's in history, there's the God who's outside of history, the God that's before order, the God that lives in everything. There's all these things, all these beliefs, but I've just found that getting down to the real core of who is this doing the believing, and then trying to get past that seems to be where the key is. Anyway, Baal Yehweh and Elohim, and a bunch of other things. Yeah, maybe I'm just blathering again, but it just seems to be all through history this is what's going on. Well, play a little guitar to end.